Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In today's episode, I wanted to cover as a free-to-play when you should invest and when you should save when it comes to commanders. Legendary sculptures are the most important resource for you as a free-to-play because they are the hardest to replace. So misspending them can set you back weeks, months, or even years depending on how bad the investment. So I wanted to briefly cover when you should save and when you should invest. First, save whenever you're not sure of a commander's longevity. So if a commander looks like it is good, but not necessarily leagues better than what you already have, you're oftentimes best off saving and waiting for the next generation or until you get more confirmation. On the other side, spend when you can get great value in support buffs or known longevity. So for example, Nevsky has such a long kit that investing in him early pays off, whereas supports as well provide a long-term buff. But ultimately, the choice is yours, so choose wisely. Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we're talking about why smite damage commanders tend to do better in short engagements when it comes to field fights. So when field fights happen, smite damage commanders tend to do very well in short burst fighting, or any normal damage heavy commander. And it's pretty straightforward for this. First, of course, normal damage, if you have more of it, you tend to do better with the individual attacks, meaning that the skill damage heavy kits that don't get to use their skills are at an inherent disadvantage. The other thing to consider is that many of the smite damage commanders also have normal damage reductions, meaning that those basic attacks that the skill damage commanders are dealing a much reduced amount, on top of the fact that you're dealing much more as a smite commander with those normal damages. These two in conjunction tend to end up with heavy trades leading towards those normal damage commanders in these short engagements. So keep that in mind when you're fighting. Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we're talking about the do's and don'ts of Echelon. So, with Echelon being one of the most underrated, underappreciated, and misunderstood formations, I wanted to cover some do's and don'ts. First, do use them with any percentage-based buffer. Mulan, Joan Prime, anything that has a percentage and not a flat amount like Rage Gain is something that could benefit from Echelon. 2. Do not use them with debuffers. Echelon does not work with debuffs, it only works with buffs. So Scipio Prime's health debuff, for example, does not work. Third, do try to double up on Echelon formation commanders that are both viable. Philip and Trajan, Trajan Bulan, Philip Bulan, Joan Prime and William. All of these combined can double dip into Echelons 1.2 times and make great value. And while even the ones that are above 25%, they only get plus 5% instead of 1.2 times it, it's totally worth the effort. Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we're talking about barbarians versus forts. First, let's talk rewards. So barbarians tend to give more gem-oriented rewards and lower amounts of other items, while forts tend to give more of the other items and less gems. Next, for honor, in the early game it's about even or slightly edged to the barbarians, while once you get to the higher levels, the forts are heavily more valuable in terms of AP per honor gained. So overall, you also have to take into account the fact that barbarian forts also give you chests that go towards your kingdom reward, which is another 18 hours of speed ups that you can gain depending on the level of your chest, so keep that in mind as well. Ultimately, the philosophy I would go with is that forts are more AP efficient, while barbarians are more time efficient, so keep that in mind. If you want quick AP, go barbs. If not, go forts. Here's what the best in slot is for infantry equipment-wise. First, at the boots, we're actually going to go with the leadership boots. 6% health is huge, and the fact that the infantry set has no health is really a big thing to have extra health somewhere. Next, for the Greaves, we also have the leadership ones, which have more health, and gives you a total of 14% health between the two items, and 3% troop defense. Next, for gloves, we have the Empire gloves. It's a pretty solid option. Overall, it isn't super crazy. Next, for the chest piece, I actually recommend you go with Hope Cloak at 12% defense. It is super useful and practical to use overall. For the weapon and helm, I recommend you either go with the Empire set for both, or you go with one Empire set and one Season of Conquest, so you at least get the 2 out of 4 set bonus to get an additional 3% troop defense, but the march speed is more or less irrelevant. Here are the traditional best in slot items for cavalry. First, we're going to start with the boots, And the Wasteland boots are the best far and away. Health is terrific, so it's worth having. Second, in the pants, we have Ash of Dawn. Again, more health is absolutely terrific, so I would recommend having that every time. At the gloves, we have Navarre's Control, our second miscellaneous of the game. And overall, just a great option because it's got good health. It's got more overall stat amount too, so that's terrific. At the chest piece, we have the Wasteland set. Again, this is a very health-heavy set, which is terrific for cavalry. So having more health is great, and it fits the set piece bonus too and gets you to 2 overall set piece for an additional 3% health. In the helm and the weapon, you can either go with the Wasteland set or the Season of Conquest item, depending on your preference. They're the same stats, just higher amount for the KvK set, and you get 4 out of 6 instead if you go with the Wasteland set. Last but certainly not least, we are on to the best in slot for archers. So for boots, I recommend Dragon's Breath. It's solid, 7.5% defense. You could go with the health item instead, but it's really not a huge difference because you get set bonuses involved. But if you do, I would recommend you also switch Dragon's Breath here to leadership. So you can either run the leadership boots and greaves or the Dragon's Breath boots and greaves. For the glove, I recommend you keep it as Dragon's Breath either way because the alternatives are about the same. For the breastplate, I recommend you keep it as Dragon's Breath and get your either 2 out of 4 or 4 out of 4 depending on what your boots and greaves are. Lastly, once you get to the helm and weapon, if you already have the 4 out of 6, you can go ahead and go with the Season of Conquest items. But if not, I recommend that you go with the Dragon's Breath set so you get the additional 3% skill damage, because currently all archers do a whole lot of skill damage. These are KvK city skins revisited. With Rise of Kingdoms removing the debuffs on all the city skins, it's become a little more of a complex question, and since it was requested, we're going over it now. So we're going to start from the bottom and go to the top. In last place, we have Flight of the Huron. Attack is just not that useful to have, so it's dead last here. In tied here, we have St. Peter's Basilica and Divine Abode. If you're a cavalry or infantry main, you know which one you want to use. And it's really beneficial if you have more than 3 marches of that specific troop type for the field, or you tend to use that overwhelmingly so. In second place, but a very, very close second, is Persian Dream. This is the better generalist option, or if you use a lot of smite damage, or just general troops that don't use skill damage, this is a great option. And in first, for now, is Twilight Falls. As more non-skill damage commanders come out, this will start to fall some more, and eventually you might see the Persian Dream taking over as the top spot with that all-unit defense. Here's what your favorite troop archetype says about you. Your favorite troop archetype is tanks. You love the longevity being a tank gets you. You like that. Even at 50k troops, you are still very much able to resist the attacks of even some full-strength enemies. You'll likely keep a handful of reports like damage dealers do, but unlike damage dealers, you keep them for a different value instead of the trade value. You like to see just how many enemies swarmed you, and just how low you got your troops, and just to see how far those little bars on your report go. It's almost like an unwritten challenge amongst tank players who like to do this, where they just see how long they can stay in the field, how many people they can get attacking them at once, and still manage to limp away to safety with any number of troops. But this isn't for the player's own gain exclusively, as each march you get focusing you is another one not focusing your damage dealers and helping you succeed. So keep it up, tank players. Leadership field commanders have struggled in the past, and that's been a huge problem. Whether you're talking about Trajan, Mulan, Honda is a notable exception, but most of the other leadership field commanders have just been duds. And there's a big reason for that. Most of what they have requires you to have at least 3 different unit types to get the most benefit. While that's great for actual mixed field units, that just doesn't fit what Rise of Kingdoms is. Rise of Kingdoms is pretty heavily a monotype field meta, whether you're talking about all archers, all cavalry, all infantry. So it's really hurt them. And really what's happened now is the solution has been released in Philip. Most of the text has been changed to be beneficial if you have 3 different unit types. Or if you only have 1 unit type, it does something different. This induces a great amount of variety, and I would love to continue to see it some more. So that's something I very much look forward to in future leadership releases. Here's why third marches of the same troop type when it comes to field tend to be really bad investment choices. So when people are building field, they tend to focus on one troop type, whether that's cavalry, infantry, or archers. But as you start to build more commanders, there's a trend. Because after those first two pairings, a lot of the commanders are really terrible. And there's a pretty clear reason for that. As the meta advances and as the power of each commander creeps up, that gap becomes more and more significant. So if you are building your first two pairings, the third pairing, you're investing the same amount of sculptures in. You're investing that 690 per commander. But you're getting the value of the third best pairing in the game, which is two significant jumps down. So you're getting a fraction of the value of those first two pairings. So oftentimes you're best off either building a support in that third pairing or building a second march of a different troop type, because it tends to create more value for the investment of sculptures. Here's why supports are great options for your extra marches. In a previous video I mentioned that when you're building a third pairing, you're often better times off building a support in that third march pairing, and here's why. So there are three major things to consider with supports. One, many of them do not need to be fully expertised, so your 690 gold head investment is a lot less than that. Second, the overall benefit of them is not in their damage, therefore is not as susceptible to the power creep of the game, because the debuff and buffs are pretty standard, and even when they jump up, they're still significant at the reduced level. And third, they tend to do well with other commanders who aren't maxed or aren't as well built, because your primary goal isn't damage, it's support. You don't necessarily have to worry about having a A++ commander with him. Therefore, it makes it a lot cheaper, a lot easier, and a lot more beneficial than trying to build a third damage pair.